Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There are some stories you can't believe are real until you hear them with your own ears. A woman giving birth, not to a stranger's child, not even to a lover's child, but to her own father's baby. A family secret so poisonous, so tangled in shame, that generations went to their graves without breathing a word. Yet in the dust of forgotten records, in whispered testimonies from the edges of American towns, the truth lingers. The story begins not in a city of lights or opportunity, but in a backwoods community where silence was a kind of religion, and bloodlines were treated like prison walls. Families didn't just live together, they folded inward. They married inside the same walls, whispered promises behind closed doors, and lived by rules that the outside world could never know. What makes this story more disturbing than others is not just the act itself, but the way it was erased, hidden in plain sight, disguised as tragedy or misfortune. People in town said the girl was sickly, that her baby wasn't right. But they didn't ask questions. In communities like this, you didn't. Asking questions meant looking into a mirror that could shatter the whole town's fragile sense of morality. What we know is that a young girl, barely into womanhood, lived under the roof of her father, a man whose authority was absolute. He decided when meals were served, when lights went out, when laughter was allowed, and when silence became law. In a house like this, love and fear were blurred together until they became indistinguishable. And in that silence, a line was crossed that should never be crossed. Months later, when she gave birth, the whispers began. Some nay. H-Boars said it was a cousin. Others said nothing at all. But behind those locked doors, everyone knew the truth. She had carried her father's child, and the weight of that truth would not stop with her. It would echo down bloodlines, twisting every future generation. This was America's darkest inbred secret. The child she brought into the world was never truly seen as a child. To outsiders, it was a mistake of nature, a baby that seemed to carry too many shadows in its blood. But to those who knew the truth, it was something far more terrifying, the living evidence of a secret no one could ever speak aloud. Imagine the silence inside that house after the birth. No joy, no laughter, no lullabies sung into the night, just the heavy weight of shame pressing down on everyone who lived within those walls. The father, who should have been protector, had now become both parent and progenitor. The daughter, once innocent, was transformed into mother of her father's own blood. And the child, that small and fragile being, was condemned before it could even open its eyes. Neighbors noticed things but chose not to speak. They said the girl no longer looked anyone in the eye. They said she aged 10 years in one. They said the father, once a man of commanding presence, now carried an anger sharper than a blade, as though he was guarding a secret that could tear the family apart if ever revealed. In towns like this, silence was survival. If you whispered about what you saw, you risked being cast out, condemned or worse, dragged into the same darkness yourself. The church pews were filled on Sundays, but the sermons didn't touch what happened behind locked doors. Religion here was about appearances, not salvation. And so the baby grew, hidden in plain sight, bearing the weight of two roles at once, a grandchild to the mother, and yet her son. The lines of family blurred until they no longer made sense. What do you call a child who is both your offspring and your sibling? What do you call yourself when your bloodline folds back onto itself? Most people would never know. But for this girl and the generations that followed, the answers were carved into their very bones. The Schembecker, hereditary, passed down like a curse. And though the town tried to bury the truth, it would eventually surface again and again, through the strange faces of children who didn't look like they should, through the hushed rumors that made their way down bar counters and church steps, and through the lingering, unshakable feeling that something in that family was deeply, irreparably wrong. As the years passed, the story should have faded. That's what the family believed, that time and silence would erase the truth. But bloodlines don't forget. They remember in ways that can't be hidden. The child, born of father and daughter, grew into someone who never quite fit the mold of the community. Whispers followed him wherever he went, whispers that no child should have to carry. In school, he was different. His mannerisms, his features, even the way he spoke, everything about him reminded people of something they couldn't name out loud. Teachers noticed, but they said nothing. Families noticed, but kept their distance. He became a ghost in plain sight, someone people saw every day but never really acknowledged. That's how communities protect themselves, by looking away. And yet, the truth festered, because the girl, now both daughter and mother, carried more than one kind of scar. She was broken in ways no doctor could heal. Living under the same roof as the man who had fathered her child meant she was never free, never allowed to escape the cycle of silence. Every meal at the table was a performance. Every glance carried weight. She had become the keeper of a secret that was too heavy for one person to bear. The father, meanwhile, grew more reclusive, his temper sharpening with age. Neighbors said they heard shouting late at night, that the girl would walk into town with her head down and her arms marked by bruises no one dared mention. People had suspicions, but suspicions don't become stories in places where reputation is more valuable than truth, so they let it continue. And then history repeated itself. Another pregnancy, another child born into a web of bloodlines that could never be untangled. This time the whispers grew louder. People began to notice that this wasn't just misfortune, it was a pattern. But instead of intervention, there was silence. Instead of help, there was distance. The family was allowed to fold in on itself, like a dying house with rotting beams, collapsing inward until nothing stable remained. And so, generation by generation, the curse deepened. Each child born not only carried the weight of what was done before, but also became a reminder of the family's darkest secret. This wasn't just a single crime. It was the creation of a legacy that would haunt the family name for decades. By now, the family's secret was no longer just a rumor. It was a shadow that followed them everywhere. People in town would cross the street to avoid them. Children were warned not to play near their property. At church, they sat in the back pews, as though the very walls might collapse if they moved too close to the altar. And yet, no one dared to say out loud what they all knew. The girl, who had once been just a victim of her father's control, had now become trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to escape. She had carried her father's children, raised them under his roof, and lived in silence while the world around her looked away. This is where the story transforms from tragedy to something even darker. It became normal. For the children growing up in that house, the unnatural felt natural. They had no point of comparison, no sense of what family was supposed to be. The lines between parent, sibling, and child were erased until they meant nothing. That's how cycles of abuse survive, not through force alone, but through confusion. When a child grows up believing that silence is love, that bruises are discipline, and that fear is loyalty, the truth becomes unrecognizable. By the time they realize what's been done to them, it's too late. They've already been shaped by it. The father aged, but his control did not weaken. If anything, it grew stronger as his children and grandchildren depended on him for food, shelter, and survival. He had created his own kingdom inside the house, and outside of those walls, no one intervened. The sheriff, the preacher, the neighbors, they all whispered, but none dared to bring the truth into the open. To do so would have meant facing not only his wrath, but the possibility that their entire community had been complicit in protecting him through their silence. What makes this story especially haunting is how long it lasted. We are not talking about one generation, but several. Children became parents, parents became grandparents, and still the secret was kept alive. With each birth, the family tree twisted further inward, its branches curling back on themselves like a plant deprived of sunlight, and for those who lived within it, escape was nearly impossible. For the outside world, the family was an oddity, a rumor, a hushed warning told to children. But for the ones inside, it was reality. And reality, no matter how dark, is the hardest prison to break free from. There came a point when the whispers could no longer stay hidden. The children born into that family began to carry visible reminders of the truth, faces that didn't look quite right, features that resembled both father and grandfather at the same time, health issues that doctors struggled to explain. The family's bloodline had folded in on itself so many times that nature began to show the scars. For outsiders, it was unsettling. People noticed, but instead of offering help, they recoiled. Fear took over, fear of being associated with them, fear of uncovering something too grotesque to confront. The family became ghosts in their own town. Their land was overgrown, their house decaying, but no one dared go near. Even the mailman left letters at the edge of the property, unwilling to step further onto cursed ground. And inside those walls, the cycle continued. Every meal eaten in silence, every birth unspoken, every child raised under the heavy shadow of secrets. The girl who had once been the daughter was now a grandmother. Her life had been stolen, reshaped, and handed back to her as something unrecognizable. She wasn't allowed to mourn, wasn't allowed to rage. She was only allowed to endure. But endurance has a cost. Trauma doesn't vanish, it festers, and in this family it became the air they breathed. The children learned that silence was safety. They grew up without trust, without boundaries, without the possibility of imagining a different life. To them, this wasn't a crime, it was simply how the world worked. And that is perhaps the most terrifying part of the story. Not just that one man crossed a forbidden line, but that he created a world where everyone who came after him was trapped inside it. The victims became participants, the participants became protectors of the secret, and the cycle tightened generation after generation. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run? Would you hide? Or would you keep the secret, just like they did? Because what comes next is the darkest chapter of all. It wasn't just a family curse anymore, it was something that would stain the history of the entire town, a secret so disturbing that even now, people hesitate to speak its name. The town eventually learned that silence could not erase blood. As the years unfolded, the family's twisted legacy became impossible to hide. Birth after birth, the signs grew clearer. The children, raised in the shadows of secrecy, began to resemble the man who had started it all, even generations later. His face, his features, his cruelty, it was all there, imprinted like a brand across every new life. But what shook the community most wasn't just what they saw in those children, it was what they felt. An unease, a sickness in the air whenever the family walked into town. People described it as though the family carried a cloud with them, a heavy atmosphere that made you look away, that made your stomach tighten. It wasn't superstition, it was the weight of a truth too dark to acknowledge. By now, the girl who had once been both daughter and mother was an old woman. Her face told the story her voice never could, lines carved by suffering, eyes hollowed by decades of silence. She had lived her entire life under one man's shadow, raising children who should have been her siblings, cradling grandchildren who were also her father's blood. And still, not once, did she speak the truth aloud. What is most haunting about this silence is that it wasn't just fear, it was belief. She had come to believe that the outside world could never understand, that no one would save her, that speaking would only bring ruin. In this way, the prison walls were not built of wood or stone, but of shame. Shame became her chains, passed down to her children like an inheritance they could never escape. The father, long buried by now, had outlived even death through the generations he created. His presence was in every face, every whispered rumor, every child who grew up never knowing where they truly belonged. He had created a legacy that poisoned not just his bloodline, but the very soil of theirs, E-Town. To speak his name was to summon a ghost that no one wanted to face. And yet, the truth lingered. It lingered in forgotten birth records, in the hushed conversations of old men at bars, in the pitying glances of women who remembered the girl's bruises but never said a word. History may be buried, but it is never gone. And when secrets are buried in blood, they always find a way to surface again. What remains of this story today is not a family, not a legacy of love or tradition, but a warning. The old house is gone now, swallowed by weeds and rot, the roof caving in long before anyone thought to tear it down. But if you stand in that field, you can still feel something in the air, an echo of all the silence, all the fear, all the shame that once lived inside those walls. Some say the ground itself feels heavy, as if it remembers. The family name has almost vanished, erased from records, changed by marriage, abandoned by those who fled. And yet the story remains. In the shadows of that forgotten town, people still whisper. They warn their children not to walk too far into the woods, not to ask too many questions, not to bring up the family that time tried to erase. But secrets like this don't vanish. They linger, waiting to be uncovered by anyone willing to dig deep enough. The girl who gave birth to her own father's baby never told her story in her own words. She carried it until her last breath, a burden too great to share. Maybe she thought silence would protect her children. Maybe she believed no one would ever believe her. Or maybe she simply knew that some truths are too dark for daylight. And so, she left behind a silence that speaks louder than any confession ever could. What we are left with is a chilling reminder of how cycles of abuse and secrecy can become their own kind of prison. It wasn't just one man's crime. It was a legacy of control, silence, and fear that reshaped generations. It shows us how entire communities can become complicit not by action, but by inaction, by looking away, by pretending not to see, by letting darkness grow unchecked. And perhaps that is the darkest truth of all, that in America's forgotten corners there are stories like this still hidden, still unspoken, still festering in the silence of families and towns that would rather bury the past than face it. So the question becomes, how many more secrets are out there, buried just beneath the surface of history? And when they rise, will we be brave enough to face them, or will we too turn away?